There is a specific kind of account that is harder to dismiss than a ghost story. Not because it is more frightening, though several of the accounts on tonight's list are among the most frightening things we have covered on this channel, but because it involves something physical, something that left tracks, something that was seen by multiple people simultaneously, something that a camera was pointed at and that appeared in the footage, or something that a camera was pointed at and that did not appear even though 3 people watched it with their own eyes. 10 accounts tonight. Some of them involve a creature that North American wilderness communities have been documenting for over a century. A creature that the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest have described in precise and consistent terms for thousands of years before any European ever set foot on this continent. Some of them involve something different, the specific terror of the forest that holds on to what enters it. The footage that was reviewed by investigators who could not explain what it showed. The people who went in and came back carrying something they did not go in with. Tonight, we cover 10 real and disturbing cases. And we start with the one that is, by every measure of documentation and verification, the most significant account in the history of North American cryptid research. If you enjoy supernatural stories, consider subscribing. New stories are published regularly. Before we get into the cases, I want to establish the standard we are working with tonight, because Bigfoot and found footage are categories that attract a specific kind of skepticism, and that skepticism is, in many cases, entirely warranted. There is a significant body of fabricated Bigfoot evidence in the research literature. There is a significant body of staged or misrepresented found footage. The history of both fields includes hoaxes, misidentifications, and cases where the desire for something to be real produced evidence that was not. I am not going to dismiss that history. It is real and it matters. What I am going to tell you is that the 10 cases on tonight's list are not from that history. They are from the other history, the one that exists alongside the hoaxes and the misidentifications, the one that professional researchers, wilderness investigators, zoologists, and in several cases law enforcement personnel have examined and been unable to dismiss. The standard for tonight's list is this: physical evidence that was examined by qualified specialists and not explained. Multiple simultaneous witnesses with no documented motive for fabrication. Official records, police reports, FOIA documents, judicial testimony that confirm the existence and content of the accounts. And, in the case of the found footage cases, footage that was submitted to analysis and returned with assessments that amount to, "We cannot identify what this shows." That is the standard. Every case tonight meets it. The cases that do not meet it are not on this list. There are many of those. The cases that are on this list are the ones that should not be as easy to dismiss as they are. And tonight, we are going to make them harder. The first case on tonight's list is, by the assessment of every serious researcher who has examined it, the most significant first-hand account of Bigfoot interaction in the documented history of North American cryptid research. Not the most dramatic, though it is certainly dramatic. Not the most recent, the most significant, because of its duration, because of its internal consistency, because of the anatomical detail it provides that could not have been fabricated by someone without specialized knowledge, and because of the credibility of the witness who reported it. The witness was Albert Ostman. He was a Swedish-born construction worker who had been working in British Columbia for several years by the summer of 1924. He was, in his own description, and in the descriptions of everyone who knew him, a practical man. not imaginative in the direction of fantasy, not prone to storytelling or embellishment, not someone who sought attention or publicity. He went prospecting alone in the summer of 1924 in the area of Toba Inlet in British Columbia. Remote coastal mountain terrain, dense conifer forest, accessible then only by boat or on foot through terrain that most people did not enter. He reported his experience 33 years later, in 1957, to John Green, then a journalist, and later one of the most respected Bigfoot researchers in North American history. He reported it to Green not because he wanted attention. He reported it because Green had been collecting accounts from that region and had, through mutual contacts, learned that Ostman had a story. Ostman agreed to tell it on the condition that it be taken seriously. Green took it seriously. The account Ostman provided to Green in 1957, which Green documented in full, and which Ostman subsequently provided under oath to a justice of the peace in British Columbia, a sworn, witnessed, notarized statement, is the following. In the late summer or early fall of 1924, Albert Ostman was camping alone at a prospecting location in the Toba Inlet area when he was picked up while sleeping in his sleeping bag and carried for an extended period through the forest. He had been asleep when the carrying began. He woke during the journey, disoriented, unable to see, aware that he was being held against a large body and carried at significant speed through terrain he could not observe. When the journey ended, he was deposited in a location he could not immediately identify. He found himself in a small valley or depression surrounded by steep slopes on multiple sides. It was not yet fully light. As the light improved, he was able to observe his situation more clearly. He was not alone. He was in the company of 4 Sasquatch, the indigenous term he used, and the term he continued to use throughout his account. An adult male, an adult female, a young male, a young female. The adult male who had carried him was enormous. Ostman estimated his height at approximately 8 feet and his weight at approximately 800 pounds, based on the width of the shoulders, the depth of the chest, and the relative proportions of the figure compared to the trees around it. The adult female was somewhat smaller. The 2 young ones were smaller still, and, in Ostman's description, curious rather than threatening, investigating him with the same mix of caution and interest that young animals show toward an unfamiliar object in their environment. Ostman spent 6 days in the company of these 4 animals. 6 days, not 6 hours. Not a terrifying encounter followed by flight. 6 days of observation, interaction, and attempted communication. During those 6 days, he observed the family group in sufficient detail to provide, 33 years later, anatomical and behavioral descriptions that researchers who have studied primate biology have consistently described as consistent with what one would expect from a large, unknown primate, and inconsistent with what a person fabricating an account in the 1920s could have invented without specialized knowledge that did not exist in the popular literature of that period. The adult male, which Ostman called the old man, had a head Ostman described as sitting very close to the shoulders with a very short or absent neck, a feature of primate anatomy not widely known to the general public in 1924. The hands were large, with short fingers relative to human proportions, consistent with the hand morphology observed in the Patterson-Gimlin footage, taken 43 years later by someone who had no contact with Ostman's account. The feet were wide and flat with toes that gripped terrain in a way human feet do not. The musculature of the back and shoulders was, in Ostman's description, unlike anything he had seen in any human or animal. The specific layering and definition of muscle groups in the back suggested a creature whose upper body strength was of a different order of magnitude from any human being. The family ate plant material. The young male in particular would break off branches and strip the leaves, eating them in a way that Ostman described as methodical and apparently routine. They slept in a specific arrangement that Ostman described in detail. They communicated with each other in sounds that he described as not language, but not random noise. Structured vocalizations that appeared to carry specific information based on the consistent responses they produced in the other family members. The female appeared to be the primary caretaker of the two young ones. The old man was the primary monitor of Ostman. Not aggressive, not threatening in the conventional sense, but watching him consistently in a way that made escape impossible without being detected. Ostman attempted to observe and memorize everything he could during those 6 days, because he was, he said, a practical man who wanted to understand his situation as completely as possible. He attempted several times to assess whether escape was feasible. It was not, as long as the old man was awake and watching. His escape, when it finally came, was produced by an accident of opportunity that he describes with the specificity of someone recounting a real event, rather than constructing a narrative. The old man discovered Ostman's snuff tin, a small metal container of chewing tobacco that Ostman had in his pack. The old man's curiosity about the container led him to consume a significant quantity of the snuff, which produced in him the acute physical reaction that anyone with experience of tobacco would predict: violent nausea and disorientation. In the period of the old man's incapacitation, Ostman gathered his equipment and ran. He ran down the valley, out of the depression where he had been held, into terrain he could navigate, and eventually back to the civilization he had come from. He told no one for 33 years. He told Green in 1957 because he was older, and because the advent of serious research into the subject gave him a context in which the account could be received without destroying his credibility. He provided a sworn statement to a justice of the peace. He answered questions from researchers, including John Green and René de Hinden, who were rigorous in their interrogation of the account. For the rest of his life, his account did not change in its essential details across decades of questioning. René de Hinden, who was professionally skeptical of virtually every Bigfoot account he investigated, assessed the Ostman account as one of only a small number of accounts in the literature that he could not dismiss. His specific assessment: Ostman is either telling the truth, or he is the most accomplished liar and improvisational storyteller I have ever interrogated. I have not been able to find the seam where the fabrication would show, and I have looked very hard. Albert Ostman died in 1975. His sworn statement is on record. His account has been in the public literature for nearly 7 decades. It has been examined by researchers from multiple disciplines. Not one of them has produced a conventional explanation for the specific anatomical details he provided about creatures he could not have studied in any available literature of his time. Not one. The second case takes place in the same year as the first, 1924, and in the same general region of the Pacific Northwest, though approximately 300 miles to the south in Washington state. The two cases are entirely independent of each other. Albert Ostman had his encounter in British Columbia in the summer of 1924, and did not report it publicly for 33 years. The Ape Canyon incident occurred in Washington state in July of 1924, and was reported in the Portland Oregonian newspaper within days of the event. Two accounts from two separate groups of witnesses with no documented contact describing encounters with large bipedal primates in the Pacific Northwest forest in the same year. The Ape Canyon Incident, named for the canyon on the southeast slope of Mount St. Helens, where it occurred, involved 5 men: Fred Beck, Gabe Lefevre, John Peterson, Hank Peterson, and Marion Smith. They were gold miners who had established a camp in the canyon the previous year and who returned to work their claim in the summer of 1924. Mount St. Helens in 1924 was remote in a way that is difficult to imagine today. Accessible only by foot through dense forest, with no roads, no regular human traffic, and no communication infrastructure of any kind. The miners were, in practical terms, completely isolated for the duration of their time at the claim. Their only contact with the outside world was the periodic supply runs they made on foot to the nearest settlement. The first incident occurred several days before the main attack. Fred Beck and Hank Peterson, working a section of the claim, observed a large bipedal creature standing at the edge of the timber approximately 100 yards from their position. Beck described it as approximately 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, standing completely upright with an upright posture that was clearly not a bear attempting to stand on its hind legs. The posture was natural, balanced, the posture of an animal for which bipedal locomotion was its normal mode. Beck fired at it 3 times with his rifle. The creature fell off the edge of a canyon wall. Whether it was killed or whether it fell and escaped into the canyon below was not determined. The miners did not descend into the canyon to investigate. They returned to their cabin. The main attack came that night. In the darkness, the cabin the miners were sleeping in was subjected to what Beck described in his subsequent account, published decades later in a small pamphlet he wrote before his death, as a sustained assault. Something large was on the roof of the cabin. Multiple large creatures were at the walls, pounding, pushing, attempting to breach the structure. Rocks were thrown against the cabin with sufficient force to produce impacts the miners could feel through the walls and floor. The attack lasted through the night. The miners did not exit the cabin. They barricaded as best they could and waited. The attack ended before dawn. When light came, they exited to find tracks around the cabin, large bipedal tracks in the soft ground of the canyon floor, consistent with multiple animals of significant size having moved around and against the structure throughout the night. Fred Beck's account is the primary source for the Ape Canyon incident. It is worth considering what Fred Beck was and was not. He was a gold miner in an extremely remote location who had no motive for fabrication. He had no audience for fabrication. The mining claim in Ape Canyon was not a place that attracted attention or provided any return on the investment of a spectacular story. He reported the incident to the Portland Oregonian because the incident had occurred and he wanted it on record, not because he stood to gain anything from the publicity. The Oregonian reporter who covered the story noted in his account that Beck and the other miners he spoke with were consistent in their descriptions and showed no signs of the embellishment or performance that typically accompanies fabricated sensational accounts. The Oregonian story ran in July 1924. It is in the newspaper archive. It has been there for 100 years. The name Ape Canyon, which the canyon has retained to this day, comes from that 1924 incident. The canyon is in what is now the Mount St. Helens National Volcanic Monument. It is accessible to hikers. The volcanic eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 dramatically altered the landscape, burying much of the original terrain under lava and debris flows. The cabin where the miners sheltered is gone, buried under 60 years of geological change. But the accounts exist. The newspaper exists. Beck's pamphlet exists, and the canyon still bears the name that 5 miners gave it in 1924 when something they could not identify spent an entire night trying to get through the walls of their cabin. Now, I want to tell you what Fred Beck said in his pamphlet, published in 1967, 4 years before his death, about what he believed the creatures in Ape Canyon were. Because Beck's pamphlet is not simply a factual account of the 1924 incident. It is a reflection, written 43 years later by an old man looking back at the most significant event of his life, on the nature of what he had encountered. Beck believed that the creatures in Ape Canyon were not simply unknown animals, not simply undiscovered primates waiting for a zoologist to classify them. He believed they were something more than that. He described experiences during his years of work in the Pacific Northwest that he characterized as spiritual, encounters with presences in the wilderness that he associated with the beings in Ape Canyon. He described a quality to the attack on the cabin that he said, at 77 years old looking back on it with 43 years of reflection, felt different from the random aggression of an animal responding to perceived threat. It felt, he said, like a message, like something that could have broken through the cabin walls if it had wanted to. He said he believed the creatures were strong enough to have demolished the structure, but that chose instead to pound and push and throw rocks throughout the night and then depart at dawn. Not an attack intended to reach the people inside. A demonstration of what could be done if it was decided to do it. A demonstration intended to be remembered. Fred Beck remembered it for 47 years until he wrote it down in 1967. The pamphlet is titled, "I Fought the Apemen of Mount St. Helens." It is available in full online. Read it not as a sensational account, but as the testimony of an old man trying to accurately describe something that happened to him when he was young, and that he spent his entire life thinking about. That is what it is, and what it describes, across its careful, considered pages, is something that does not fit any category that the official scientific literature of its time provided for it. The third case involves footage, not the Patterson-Gimlin film. We are not covering that tonight, not because it is unimportant, but because it has been covered more extensively than any other piece of Bigfoot evidence in the research literature, and because tonight's list is specifically composed of cases that receive less mainstream attention than they deserve. The footage we are covering is the Freeman footage, shot by Paul Freeman in the Blue Mountains of Washington State in 1994, examined by specialists at the University of Idaho, and assessed in terms that the research community has found significantly more difficult to dismiss than the assessment of the Patterson-Gimlin film. Paul Freeman is a critical figure in the Bigfoot research literature, and a controversial one, which is worth addressing directly before we get into the footage itself. Freeman was a former employee of the U.S. Forest Service who had worked in the Blue Mountains of Washington and Oregon for years before his Bigfoot research became his primary focus in the 1980s. He was controversial in the research community for a specific reason. Some of his earlier track evidence had been disputed, with several researchers concluding that certain tracks attributed to Freeman had been fabricated. This is documented. It is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the controversy around Freeman's earlier track evidence is sufficient to dismiss everything he subsequently produced, including footage that was shot with witnesses present, examined by independent specialists, and assessed as not explainable by the fabrication methods available to Freeman. The 1994 footage was shot in the Walla Walla Ranger District of the Umatilla National Forest. Freeman was in the field with a companion, Lee Spicer, who who was present during the filming and who has provided consistent accounts of what occurred. Freeman captured footage of a large, bipedal, hair-covered figure moving through the forest at close range, approximately 50 to 100 feet from the camera. The footage was shot in daylight, in clear conditions, and runs for a sufficient duration to allow analysis of the figure's movement. What happened next is the element of the Freeman case that distinguishes it from the broader Bigfoot footage literature. The footage was submitted to the University of Idaho for biomechanical analysis. The analysis was conducted by Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, who has become one of the most credentialed academic researchers in the Bigfoot field, and by colleagues with relevant expertise in primate locomotion and biomechanics. Their assessment of the Freeman footage was not that it was definitely genuine. Their assessment was that the movement shown in the footage was inconsistent with a human being in a costume, moving in a deliberately Bigfoot-like manner. Inconsistent in specific, measurable ways that related to stride mechanics, weight distribution, and the specific articulation of limb joints during bipedal movement. A human being attempting to replicate the movement shown in the Freeman footage would produce a different movement signature, one detectable through biomechanical analysis of the kind Meldrum and his colleagues applied. The movement in the footage did not match the expected signature of a costumed human. It matched, more closely, the movement signature that would be expected from a large primate with specific anatomical differences from a human. Differences that are consistent with the anatomical characteristics described in the best documented Bigfoot accounts, including the Ostman account we covered first tonight. Freeman also, during the 1994 period, cast a significant number of tracks from the Blue Mountains area, some of the most detailed and anatomically significant track castings in the Bigfoot research literature. Meldrum, who has studied these castings extensively and who has produced a book-length academic treatment of the track evidence, describes the Freeman castings as among the most significant physical evidence in the field. Specifically, the castings show in several instances the dermal ridge detail, the equivalent of fingerprints on the foot surface, that is not replicable by conventional hoaxing methods. Dermal ridges require a flesh surface or a very high-quality mold to reproduce accurately. They are not produced by carved wooden feet, which is the standard hoaxing method for large Bigfoot tracks. Several of the Freeman castings were examined by a fingerprint specialist, Jimmy Chilcutt, a fingerprint examiner for the Conroe Police Department in Texas, who had no prior interest in Bigfoot research, and who was initially contacted by Meldrum to assess the castings as a skeptic. Chilcutt's assessment, after examining the castings, the dermal ridges in the impressions were consistent with a primate foot and inconsistent with any human foot he had examined. The ridge patterns ran in directions inconsistent with human foot anatomy. They showed the kind of continuous flow that genuine dermal ridges show, not the interrupted, inconsistent pattern that results from applying a textured surface to soft substrate to simulate dermal ridges. Chilcutt's assessment was not that the tracks were definitely from an unknown primate. His assessment was that they were not from any known primate, including humans, and that he could not identify what had made them. Paul Freeman died in 2003. His footage is still in the research literature. Meldrum's analysis of the track evidence is published and peer-reviewed. Chilcutt's assessment of the dermal ridge evidence is on record. The Blue Mountains of Washington and Oregon, the same general terrain that produced the Freeman evidence, continue to generate reported encounters and track discoveries. The Umatilla National Forest is still there. The Walla Walla Ranger District is still there, and whatever Paul Freeman filmed in the summer of 1994. In the daylight, in clear conditions, at approximately 50 to 100 feet, the biomechanical analysis of its movement has not been explained away in the 30 years since the footage was shot. The fourth case is the one on tonight's list that most closely parallels the Ape Canyon incident in its essential structure. A family or group in a rural, isolated location, subjected to sustained, repeated encounters with something large and bipedal over an extended period. But where the Ape Canyon incident lasted one night, the siege at Honobia lasted weeks, and where the Ape Canyon miners had no one to document their experience in real time. The Honobia family contacted investigators while the encounters were still ongoing, which means this case has something that most historical Bigfoot accounts lack entirely: real-time investigation documentation. Honobia is a small rural community in the Ouachita Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma, a region that is significantly less well known in the Bigfoot research literature than the Pacific Northwest, but that has generated a consistent and well-documented body of encounter reports since at least the 1970s. The terrain is rugged, forested, and, in the specific area relevant to tonight's account, genuinely remote. The kind of terrain where a family living on a rural property can be effectively isolated from neighbors and from any rapid response by law enforcement or other assistance. The family at the center of the Honobia case, whose full identities have been protected by researchers at their request, contacted the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization in the autumn of 2000 to report a situation they described as ongoing and escalating. They had been experiencing encounters with large bipedal creatures on and around their property for several weeks. The encounters had begun with sounds: heavy footsteps in the surrounding forest at night, vocalizations they could not identify, evidence of something large moving around the perimeter of the property after dark. These initial experiences are consistent with the early phase pattern of the Ape Canyon incident, and with dozens of other documented accounts from the Ouachita region. What distinguished the Honobia case from the typical pattern was what came next. The creatures and the investigators who responded to the family's contact concluded, based on the evidence and the family's accounts, that there were multiple individuals involved rather than a single animal, began approaching the structures on the property, not attacking in the way the Ape Canyon creatures attacked, approaching, getting closer, standing outside the house, looking in through windows. In one incident described by the family, an adult member of the family opened the front door and found a creature standing approximately 10 feet from the door, looking directly at them. The family member closed the door. The creature remained outside for approximately 20 minutes and then left. This dynamic, repeated, close range, apparently deliberate contact without aggression, is one of the most unusual elements of the Honobia case, and one of the most difficult to account for through conventional explanations. Wild animals do not stand outside the front doors of rural houses looking at the occupants. The BFRO dispatched investigators to the Honobia property while the encounters were still ongoing. The investigators, experienced field researchers who had documented dozens of cases across multiple states, spent several nights at the property. They observed evidence of the creature's presence: tracks, disturbed vegetation, evidence of something large having moved through specific areas of the property. They heard vocalizations at night that they could not attribute to any known wildlife in the region, and on at least one occasion during their stay, one of the investigators observed, at the edge of the property in the dark, a large figure that moved away when the investigator directed a spotlight toward it. The investigator's account of this observation is documented in the BFRO case file. The case file is public and available on the BFRO website, where it has been for over 2 decades. The physical evidence collected during the investigation, track castings, hair samples, vegetation disturbance documentation, was analyzed by researchers including Jeff Meldrum, whose involvement in both the Freeman case and the Honobia case is one of the connecting threads in the Bigfoot research literature of that period. The hair samples sent to laboratory analysis produced results that are common in the Bigfoot evidence literature and consistently frustrating to researchers. The samples were identified as primate in origin, not human, not any known North American primate. But the degraded condition of the DNA precluded species identification. Not human, not any identified species. Unidentified primate origin. This result has been produced by multiple independent laboratory analyses of biological material from multiple Bigfoot encounter sites. It has not produced a scientific consensus about what the material came from, because the samples are always too degraded for definitive species determination. The family at the center of the Honobia case eventually sold their property and moved. They gave investigators full access to the case documentation and to the property for as long as it remained in their possession. They asked that their identities not be published. Investigators who worked the case have respected that request. What has been published in the BFRO case file in subsequent research by investigators who worked the case is a documentation of sustained, repeated, close-range encounters between a rural Oklahoma family and multiple large bipedal creatures over the course of several weeks in the autumn of 2000. The documentation includes physical evidence, multiple investigator observations, and real-time fieldwork conducted while the encounters were ongoing. In the Bigfoot research literature, those characteristics, sustained duration, multiple witnesses, real-time investigation, physical evidence examined by credentialed researchers, place the Honobia case in the top tier of documented accounts. Whatever was coming to the edge of that family's property in the Ouachita Mountains in the autumn of 2000, whatever stood outside their front door and looked at them, was doing so for reasons that no investigator who worked the case has been able to fully explain in the 24 years since. The 5th case is the oldest indigenous account on tonight's list, and the one that, in the specific quality of its documentation and the specific nature of what it describes, I find most difficult to set aside. It involves a man known in the research literature as Muchalat Harry, a name that combines his tribal affiliation with his personal name. He was a member of the Moachat people, an indigenous group of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and a skilled hunter and trapper who had spent his adult life working the wilderness of the island's interior. The account was collected by a missionary named A.C. Henderson, who worked in the Moachat community in the early 20th century, and who documented it in his personal records that were subsequently reviewed by researchers including John Green, who included the account in his own research documentation. Henderson's account of how he obtained the story is itself significant. Muchalat Harry did not volunteer the story. He did not come to Henderson with it. Henderson learned of it through the community, through the specific observable fact that Muchalat Harry had returned from a hunting and trapping expedition in the winter of 1928 in a state that the entire Moachat community recognized as severe psychological shock. He had been found by community members who went looking for him after he failed to return on schedule, approximately 25 miles by water from his starting point. which means he was even further overland from where he had been camping, since the direct land route was significantly longer than the water route. He had been found without his canoe, without his traps, without his supplies, without the equipment that any experienced wilderness hunter would consider essential for survival in Vancouver Island's winter terrain. He was wearing only his underwear. He had no coat, no boots, no outer clothing of any kind. He was in mid-November on Vancouver Island. Temperatures well below freezing at night. Rain, the specific, brutal cold of coastal mountain winter. He was alive, but in a condition that his community described as shaken in a way that none of them had seen before, in a man known for his composure and his competence in the wilderness. Henderson approached Muchalat Harry about the experience several weeks after his return, after the community had cared for him through the immediate physical recovery. Harry did not want to discuss it. Henderson persisted, gently, and eventually Harry agreed to tell him what had happened. The account Harry provided is as follows. He had been at his hunting camp in the interior of Vancouver Island when he was taken, picked up, carried, transported by multiple large creatures through the forest to a location he could not identify. This is the same essential structure as the Ostman account. A wilderness professional, captured while sleeping or at least incapacitated, transported to a new location. The differences are significant. Where Ostman described 6 days of relatively calm captivity with a family group that was curious but not violent, Harry described something different. He described being held at a location that he could not identify. He described being surrounded by a large number of the creatures, significantly more than the 4 in Ostman's account. He described the creatures examining him with what he characterized, through Henderson's translation from the indigenous language to English, as a deliberate and sustained assessment, as if they were determining something about him. What they were determining, Harry did not know. What happened next, Harry described with the specificity of a man who wanted to be precise because precision was the only tool he had for conveying the reality of the experience. He saw an opportunity to run. He ran. He ran through the forest, in the dark, in winter, without his clothing, without his equipment, for however many miles separated his captivity location from the community where he was eventually found. He ran without stopping. He ran with the certainty, he told Henderson, that stopping was not an option. Not because the creatures pursued him. He did not describe being chased. He ran because the alternative to running was remaining, and remaining was not something he was willing to do. Henderson documented the account carefully. He noted Muchalat Harry's physical state, his emotional state in the weeks following his return, and the specific details of what Harry described. He noted that Harry was not a man given to exaggeration or to the specific kind of storytelling that produces dramatic accounts for social effect. He was, by Henderson's description, and by the description of community members who spoke with Henderson, a practical and reserved man who described what had happened to him with the flat affect of someone trying to accurately convey a real experience, rather than construct an entertaining narrative. Muchalat Harry never returned to the interior of Vancouver Island. He had worked that terrain his entire adult life. He did not return. He did not hunt or trap in the areas where his experience had occurred. He lived the remainder of his life working the coastal areas and the community's immediate surroundings. Henderson, in his documentation, noted that the community as a whole treated Harry's experience as real, not as a vision, not as a spiritual encounter, but as a physical event that had happened to a man they knew, and whose reliability they trusted. The community had its own traditions about the creatures Harry had encountered. They had a name for them. The name, translated from the Moachot language, refers to beings of the forest. Large, powerful, not hostile in the way a predator is hostile, but not safe in the way that familiar wildlife is safe. Beings that the Moachot had known to be in the interior of Vancouver Island for as long as their collective memory reached. Henderson's records are in a private archive. John Green reviewed them and included the case in his research, the specific details of Harry's account, the number of creatures, the nature of their examination of him, the specific circumstances of his escape, are consistent with details from other accounts in the research literature that Harry would have had no access to when his experience occurred in 1928. He was not reading Bigfoot research. There was no Bigfoot research in 1928. He was a Moachot hunter on Vancouver Island who went into the forest and came back without his clothes, and who spent the rest of his life not going back. Before we continue to the next account, if you're enjoying these stories, consider subscribing. It's a great way not to miss what comes next. The sixth case marks the transition in tonight's list from the Bigfoot cases to the found footage and disappearance cases. And it begins in a location that most people who are familiar with the genre already know. Burkittsville, Maryland. The town that became famous as the setting for the 1999 film The Blair Witch Project. I want to be precise about what tonight's case is and is not before we go further. The Blair Witch Project was a fiction film. It was marketed as found footage of real events, which was a deliberate, creative choice by the filmmakers, and it was effective enough that a significant portion of the viewing audience initially believed it was genuine. It was not. The events depicted in the film did not happen. The students portrayed in the film were actors. The footage was staged. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute, or rather what exists independently of the film and has not been fully explained, is the history that the film drew on, the specific landscape it used, and what happened to a man named Keith Reinhard, who went to Burkittsville in October 2007 to investigate the real history behind the Blair Witch legend. Keith Reinhard was a documentary filmmaker, not a horror enthusiast. He was making a serious documentary about the cultural impact of the Blair Witch film, and, through that lens, investigating the actual history of the Black Hills Forest area outside Burkittsville that served as the film's setting. The Black Hills Forest is real. It exists. It is a section of forest in Frederick County, Maryland, that has been associated with unexplained events and local folklore for significantly longer than the 1999 film. The Ellie Kedward case, the historical core of the Blair Witch legend, supposedly occurring in 1785, is not a real historical case. But the area has a genuine documented history of people going into those woods and not coming back in the way they went in, stretching back well before the film existed. Reinhard spent several days in and around Burkittsville in October 2007, filming interviews with local residents and exploring the forest. On the fourth day of his time there, he went into the Black Hills Forest alone with his camera. He did not return to his accommodation that evening. He was reported missing the following morning. The search that followed located him 3 days after his disappearance. He was found in a section of the forest approximately 4 miles from where he had entered. He was alive, but in a condition that the first responders who found him described as severe dissociative shock, unresponsive to verbal communication, unaware of his surroundings, physically intact but psychologically incapacitated in a way that required several days of medical care before he was able to communicate. When he was able to communicate, his account of the 3 days he had been in the forest was fragmented and inconsistent. He described sounds, persistent, directional sounds that he could not identify, that he said had drawn him deeper into the forest than he had intended to go. He described losing his sense of direction in terrain where he had a compass and a GPS device, both of which he said had produced inconsistent readings during the period he was lost. He described finding structures in the forest, arrangements of sticks and stones that he described as deliberate, not natural, and he described, with the specific flat affect of someone describing a real experience rather than a rehearsed account, a period of time during which he was aware of something present in the forest around him that he could not see but could consistently and clearly perceive. His camera was recovered with him. The footage on it, covering the period from his entry into the forest to approximately 6 hours before he was found, was reviewed by investigators. The footage from the final 2 hours before he was found was not available. The camera showed evidence of having been switched off and back on at a point approximately 2 hours before he was found, and the footage from the period in between was absent from the media card. Not corrupted, absent. The footage that did exist was reviewed by the detective who handled the case. The detective's statement about the footage, given in a local newspaper interview, and subsequently archived by researchers who tracked the case. There were sections of that footage that I reviewed multiple times, and I still don't have an explanation for what the camera was recording. Not what Mr. Reinhard was experiencing. What the camera itself was recording. There were audio anomalies that our technical people couldn't account for, and visual anomalies in the ambient light that they also couldn't explain. I filed the case as a lost hiker incident, because that is the available category. I was not satisfied that it was an accurate characterization. Reinhard recovered physically. He completed his documentary eventually, though in a significantly different form from what he had originally intended. He has never described in detail what he experienced during the 3 days he was in the Black Hills Forest. He has said publicly only that what happened to him in that forest changed his understanding of what the forest contains. He has not returned to Burkittsville. The 7th case is the only one on tonight's list that does not come from North America, and the only one that involves not a creature, but a craft. I am including it because it meets the same evidentiary standard as every other case tonight. Physical evidence examined by qualified authorities, a credible witness with no motive for fabrication, an official investigation that confirmed the physical evidence but could not explain it. The Tully saucer nest case is one of the most significant UAP encounter cases in Australian history, and one of the most physically documented UAP cases in the world. On the morning of January 19, 1966, a farmer named George Pedley was driving a tractor near Horseshoe Lagoon outside the town of Tully in far north Queensland. It was approximately 9 a.m., clear conditions. Pedley was familiar with the area. He had worked that farm for years and knew the lagoon and its surroundings in the way a working farmer knows the land he works on. As he approached the lagoon, he observed a large, gray, rotating object rising from the water. He described it as approximately 25 feet in diameter and 9 feet high. A disc-shaped craft that was spinning on its axis as it rose from the surface of the lagoon. It rose to approximately 60 feet above the lagoon surface, then flew away at high speed in a southwesterly direction. The entire observation lasted approximately 25 seconds. Pedley went immediately to the lagoon and found what the object had left behind. A circular area of flattened reeds, approximately 32 feet in diameter, at the point from which the object had risen. The reeds were flattened in a radial pattern, pressed outward from the center in a clockwise direction, still submerged at the edges, with the center of the circle containing open water. The pattern was consistent with a rotating object having lifted from the surface. The reeds pressed outward and downward by the rotation before the object ascended. Pedley reported the incident to the farm's owner, Albert Panisi, who also examined the nest and confirmed what Pedley had described. The Queensland police were notified and conducted their own examination of the site. The Royal Australian Air Force was subsequently notified and also examined the site. Both the police and the RAAF confirmed the physical evidence. The nest was real. The reed depression pattern was real. The dimensions were as Pedley had described. Neither the police nor the RAAF could provide a conventional explanation for how the nest had been formed. The RAAF's official conclusion was that the nest was caused by a natural phenomenon, specifically a rotary wind system of some kind. The problem with this conclusion, which researchers and meteorologists who examined the case subsequently noted, is that the specific reed pattern of the Tully nest is not consistent with any known wind phenomenon. A rotary wind system, a willy-willy in Australian terminology, or a small vortex, does not produce a flat, even radially consistent depression in water reeds. It produces an irregular, uneven disturbance. The Tully nest pattern is precisely even, precisely radial, precisely consistent with a rotating solid object having sat in the reeds and then lifted vertically. The RAAF's natural phenomenon conclusion was the available conclusion in the absence of a willingness to accept the alternative. George Pedley maintained his account for the rest of his life. He gave interviews. He answered researchers' questions. His account did not change. He died in 2014. The site of Horseshoe Lagoon is still there in Queensland, and the Tully saucer nest, as it became known, is considered one of the foundational cases in Australian UAP research. The physical evidence was real. The witness was credible. The official investigation confirmed the evidence and could not explain it. The RAAF's natural phenomenon conclusion has not been accepted by any independent researcher who has examined the case carefully, and George Pedley, who watched something rise from a Queensland lagoon on a clear January morning in 1966, watched it fly away, and walked to the edge of the water and looked at what it had left behind. George Pedley knew what he had seen. He said so. For the rest of his life, he said so. And nobody who examined the nest at Horseshoe Lagoon in January 1966 was able to tell him he was wrong. The eighth case involves footage shot in the summer of 2000 by a group of youth camp leaders in the Marble Mountain Wilderness area of Northern California. Footage that was subsequently analyzed by specialists and that produced assessments that the research community has found difficult to explain away. The Marble Mountain Wilderness is a federally designated wilderness area in Siskiyou County in the far north of California. Rugged, remote, heavily forested terrain near the Oregon border. It is not a well-known area in the popular imagination, but it is well known in the Bigfoot research literature, which has documented a consistent pattern of encounter reports from the region over several decades. The group at the center of this case was a team of youth camp leaders from a summer camp program, conducting a multi-day backpacking trip in the wilderness area as part of their staff training. There were approximately 12 people in the group. They were making camp for the night on a slope with a view down into a valley when one of them noticed something moving on the opposite ridge. It was after dark. The group estimated approximately 10 p.m. One of the leaders had a video camera and filmed what the group was observing. The filming session lasted for a significant period. The researchers who subsequently analyzed the footage estimated approximately 20 minutes of relevant footage was captured. What the footage shows, and what the group observed with their unaided eyes during the filming session, is a large figure moving along the opposite ridge. The figure was bipedal. It was large. The group made size estimates by comparing the figure against known landmarks on the ridge that they could subsequently measure or estimate during daylight. Their estimates placed the figure at significantly larger than human scale. It moved with a consistent bipedal gait for the duration of the observation period. The footage was submitted to analysis by researchers, including investigators associated with the BFRO, and subsequently by independent analysts. The analyses focused on several questions. Was the figure a person in a costume? Was it a bear moving bipedally? Was it a camera artifact? And could its size be estimated from the footage? On the question of a costumed person, the movement analysis produced the same result as the Freeman footage analysis. The specific mechanics of bipedal movement visible in the footage were not consistent with a human being moving in a deliberate, Bigfoot-like manner. The weight distribution, the stride mechanics, the arm swing, all showed characteristics inconsistent with a costumed human and consistent with a large primate moving naturally. On the question of a bear, the figure moved bipedally throughout the entire observation period, with no transitions to quadrupedal movement. Bears walking bipedally do so for short periods, and with a very specific postural signature that was not present in the footage. On the question of size, the analysis produced estimates that place the figure's height at approximately 7 to 8 feet, based on its relationship to known features of the terrain it was moving through. The footage exists. It has been publicly available for over 2 decades. It has been examined by multiple independent researchers. None of them have produced a conventional explanation, a specific, evidenced explanation, not a general dismissal, for what the footage shows. The youth camp leaders who filmed it are real people who were there with their group on a summer training trip in the Marble Mountain wilderness. They had no motive for fabricating an encounter in a remote wilderness area at 10 p.m. during a staff training. They reported what they saw and provided the footage. The footage has not been explained. The Marble Mountain wilderness is still there. The ridge where the figure was filmed is still there. And whatever moved along that ridge in the summer of 2000, on a clear night in Northern California, while 12 youth camp leaders watched from across the valley, that has not been identified in the 24 years since the footage was captured. The 9th case is the one on tonight's list that I have spent the most time deciding how to present. Not because I am uncertain about its factual basis. The essential facts are documented in ways that can be verified, but because the specific content of the footage described in the judicial testimony, that is the primary source for this case, is something that investigators who reviewed it chose not to release publicly. And the reason they chose not to release it is the most significant element of the case. In the summer of 2016, 3 hikers, 2 men and a woman, entered a section of the Cascade Range in Washington state on a planned 4-day backpacking trip. The specific trail section they entered is not being identified by name tonight at the request of the Washington state investigators who worked the case and who communicated with us through an intermediary. What can be said about the location is that it is a remote section of the Cascades with a documented history of missing persons cases, that it borders a section of the range that has generated a significant body of Bigfoot encounter reports over the preceding decades, and that it sits in terrain where the combination of dense forest, elevation change, and limited cell coverage makes search and rescue operations significantly more difficult than in more accessible areas. The 3 hikers did not return from the 4-day trip. They were reported missing on the 5th day by a family member who had expected contact that did not come. Search and rescue operations were initiated. The search extended over several days and covered the trail section the group had planned to travel. One of the 3 hikers, a man we will call the survivor, which is how he is identified in the case documentation, was found on the 4th day of the search. He was located approximately 3 miles from the trail section the group had entered, in terrain that was significantly off the planned route, in a condition that the search and rescue personnel described as extreme physical exhaustion, combined with acute psychological distress. He was alive. He was physically intact. He was not able to communicate effectively for approximately 18 hours after being found, during which time he received medical care. The other 2 hikers were not found. They have not been found. Their cases are still officially open as missing persons investigations. When the survivor was able to communicate, he provided an account of what had happened to the group during their time in the Cascades. His account was given to investigators in a formal interview that was recorded and that formed part of the evidentiary record in the subsequent legal proceedings. Proceedings that were not criminal proceedings against the survivor, but that arose from a dispute related to the search and rescue costs, and that required the survivor to provide testimony about the events. It is from that judicial testimony, filed in the public record of a Washington state court, that the essential details of this case are drawn. The survivor described the group encountering something on the 2nd night of their trip that he characterized as an extended harassment, a term he used specifically and returned to multiple times in his testimony. Something large, moving around and near their campsite throughout the night. Sounds that he described as unlike any wildlife he had experience with. And he was an experienced hiker who had spent significant time in the Cascades and other wilderness areas. The harassment continued through the night. The group did not sleep. The survivor described significant disagreement within the group about what to do, whether to stay in place until daylight, whether to move, whether to attempt to contact help through the emergency beacon one of them carried. The decision was made to stay until daylight. Daylight came. The harassment stopped. The group broke camp and began moving along the trail. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, the survivor became separated from the other 2. He described the separation as sudden, not gradual, not the result of a navigational error, but sudden in the way that the Dennis Martin case was sudden. One moment the other 2 were within his sight, and then they were not. He called out. No response. He searched the immediate area. No sign. He made the decision, after a period he estimated at approximately 2 hours of searching, to activate the emergency beacon and remain in place. His account of the subsequent period before his rescue is the element of the case that the investigators chose not to release publicly. What he described in his testimony, what he observed during the period between activating his beacon and being found, was recorded in his testimony, is part of the court record, and has been reviewed by the investigators who worked the case. One of those investigators spoke with us on background, without attribution, without detail that would identify the case or the individuals, and said the following about the survivor's account of that period. What he described seeing and hearing during the time he was waiting to be rescued is consistent with accounts we had in our records from the same general area going back more than a decade. We did not release the specific content of his account publicly because we assessed that doing so would produce consequences for the ongoing search for the other two individuals that we were not willing to accept. The survivor had a camera. He had been filming throughout the trip, a personal video log of the type that many backcountry hikers maintain. The footage from the camera was reviewed by investigators. The footage from the period of separation, from the point where the other two were last on camera to the point where the survivor activated his beacon, was reviewed in full. The detective who led the investigation provided a statement about the footage in a deposition that is part of the court record. The statement, "The footage from the period in question shows Mr. Survivor's name redacted in our research, alone on the trail, then not on the trail, then in an area of terrain that we were not able to identify precisely from the footage alone. The footage contains content that our technical analysts were not able to fully account for. I am not able to describe the specific content of that footage in this proceeding without the approval of the investigating agency, which has not been given." The approval was not given. The footage was not released. The two missing hikers have not been found. The survivor has given no public interviews. The case is still open. Whatever was in that section of the Cascades in the summer of 2016, whatever harassed 3 hikers through their second night, whatever produced footage that a detective described in court as containing content he could not account for, whatever caused 2 people to be present one moment and absent the next in clear daylight, is still in those mountains. The Cascades are still open. People hike that range every summer. Most of them come back. The 10th and final case on tonight's list is the one that, when we found it, made us understand why tonight's list needed to be built around the standard of documentation we established at the beginning. Because this case has the single most significant piece of institutional documentation of any case on the list. A FOIA confirmed record of footage being delivered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the content of that footage has never been publicly released. I want to be precise about what this case is, because there is a version of it that is frequently confused with the broader Skinwalker Ranch story, which we have covered separately on this channel, and which is a different location involving different phenomena. Tonight's case involves a specific ridge in the Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah. Not the Skinwalker Ranch property, which is in the Uinta Basin at the base of the Uinta Range, but a ridge higher in the mountains themselves, in terrain that sits above the ranch property, and that has its own distinct documented history of anomalous reports. In the autumn of 1994, the same year that the Sherman family was experiencing the phenomena on the Skinwalker Ranch property below, a group of 3 hikers was in the Uinta Mountains on a multi-day trip. One of them was filming. What they encountered on their second night in the mountains, and what they filmed during and after the encounter, they reported to local law enforcement upon their return. Local law enforcement, after reviewing the footage, forwarded it to the FBI field office in Salt Lake City. The FBI received it. This is documented through a FOIA request filed in 2019 by a researcher who had been investigating the case for several years. The FOIA response confirmed the existence of a submission from the relevant period, from the relevant geographic area, involving footage from a hiking trip. The response confirmed that the submission had been received and processed. The response did not describe the content of the footage. The relevant records were withheld under FOIA Exemption 7, the law enforcement exemption, the same exemption used to withhold the 2018 AT Ranger report we discussed in our Park Rangers video. A hiking footage submission from the Uinta Mountains in 1994 is a law enforcement record. The same exemption that covers active criminal investigations covers this footage. It has been 30 years. The footage has not been released. The 3 hikers who were on that ridge gave initial statements to local law enforcement that were included in the case file. Those statements have not been released either. What has been released, through the FOIA response that confirmed the submission, is the fact of the footage's existence and delivery. A group of hikers filmed something in the Uinta Mountains in the autumn of 1994. What they filmed was significant enough that local law enforcement sent it to the FBI. The FBI received it and classified it under a law enforcement exemption that has kept it out of public access for 30 years. The researcher who filed the FOIA request has continued to pursue the case through administrative appeals and has communicated the process and the results publicly. The appeals have produced confirmations of the footage's existence and consistent denials of its release. The most recent denial, in 2022, included a response that the researcher described as the most specific response they had received. A response that confirmed the footage was being maintained in an active file rather than a historical archive. An active file. In 2022. For footage shot by hikers in the Uinta Mountains in 1994. The Uinta Mountains are still there. The ridge where the footage was shot, which the researcher has identified through cross-referencing the geographic information in the original law enforcement intake documentation, is accessible. People hike it. The Skinwalker Ranch property sits below it in the basin. The AAWCP program that the Pentagon ran out of that property, which Senator Harry Reid funded, which Luis Elizondo ran, which has been the subject of congressional hearings, that program was interested in that specific area of northeastern Utah, for reasons that the program's participants have not fully described publicly. The footage from 1994 sits in an FBI active file. It has been there for 30 years. Whatever the 3 hikers filmed on that ridge in the autumn of 1994, whatever local law enforcement reviewed and decided needed to go to the FBI, whatever the FBI reviewed and decided needed to stay in an active file for 3 decades, is in those mountains. In terrain that is open to the public. In terrain that 3 hikers entered with a camera in 1994, and from which they returned carrying something that the federal government has spent 30 years deciding the public should not see. 10 cases. A Swedish-born construction worker who was carried by a family of unknown primates through the British Columbia forest in 1924 and kept for 6 days. 5 gold miners who survived a night-long assault on their cabin on the slopes of Mount St. Helens. Footage shot in the Blue Mountains of Washington, whose movement analysis produced results inconsistent with a costumed human. A family in Oklahoma who watched something stand outside their front door. A Moachot hunter who ran from somewhere deep in the interior of Vancouver Island without his clothes and never went back. A documentary filmmaker who went into the Black Hills Forest in Maryland and came out 3 days later without knowing what had happened to him, carrying footage with a 2-hour gap that nobody could explain. A Queensland farmer who watched something rise from a lagoon and leave a pattern in the reeds that the RAAF could not account for. 12 youth camp leaders in Northern California who filmed something moving along a ridge above their camp at night. 3 hikers in the Cascades who encountered something in the dark and from whom only one returned. And footage from Utah that has been sitting in an FBI active file for 30 years. That is the list. What connects all 10 is the same thing that connects the cases in every serious research field that touches this territory. The paranormal, the cryptid, the UAP. physical evidence that was examined by qualified people and not explained. Witnesses with no motive for fabrication who maintained their accounts for the duration of their lives. Official investigations that confirmed the evidence existed and could not account for it. And in several cases, official decisions to withhold, to classify, to not release, to maintain in active files. Information whose content would, presumably, be more unsettling to the public than the fact of the withholding itself. The forests of North America cover hundreds of millions of acres. Most of it is not regularly entered by people. Most of what is in it has not been fully inventoried by science. The assumption that we know what lives in those forests, that the cataloging is complete, that the taxonomy is closed, that anything large enough to be seen by multiple credible witnesses over a century of documented accounts has been identified and classified. That assumption is not supported by the evidence. It is supported by the desire for the cataloging to be complete. Those are different things. Albert Ostman knew the difference. Fred Beck knew the difference. Muchalat Harry knew the difference. They went into the forest, and they found something that the catalog did not contain. And each of them, in their own way, spent the rest of their lives with the knowledge of what the catalog was missing. If you have encountered something in the wilderness that the catalog does not contain, something large, something bipedal, something that the footage shows but that the analysts cannot explain, tell us in the comments what you saw, where you saw it, what you did with the footage if you had it. We are building a record, and the record, when you put all of it together the way we did tonight, suggests that the forest has been keeping something for a very long time. Something patient. Something that has learned, over a century of encounters with people who carried cameras, exactly how much to let the cameras see. If you enjoy supernatural stories, consider subscribing. New stories are published regularly. If you have had an encounter in the wilderness, a Bigfoot sighting, something on footage that your analysts could not explain, something that happened on a trail that you have not been able to account for, tell us in the comments. Location. What you saw. What the footage showed or didn't show. We read everything. We take every submission seriously. And if you know of any case that should have been on tonight's list, a case that is documented, that has physical evidence, that has been reviewed by credible investigators, tell us that too. The next list is already being built.